I built my case on nothing. With this lapidary phrase, Max Stirner summarized the essence of his philosophy, breaking the intellectual norms of his time. Now we will see the hard life and the most important work of this extraordinary thinker who was not only a philosopher, but an intellectual bomb that demolished the inviolable foundations of many of the collective illusions. Information about his life is scant and fragmentary, and much of what is known is due to the work of John Henry Mackay, who published a biography of his life, collected testimonies and documents more than 40 years after his death. There are no photographs or certain portraits of him made during his lifetime. The only authentic representation seems to be a caricature drawn by Friedrich Engels, which also created some confusion, leading to mistaken identifications with images of other thinkers. Max Stirner, pseudonym of Johann Caspar Schmidt, was born on October 25, 1806, in Bayreuth, Germany, in northern Bavaria. His pseudonym, Stirner, probably derives from a nickname given to him because of his high, prominent forehead, a distinguishing feature that characterized him. Son of Albert Christian Heinrich Schmidt and Sophia Eleonora Rheinlein, flute carvers, he lost his father less than a year after his birth. His mother remarried 2 years later to Heinrich Ballerstedt, an assistant pharmacist, and the family moved to Kulm, Prussia. In 1818, at the age of 12, he returned to Bayreuth, and the following year he enrolled at the local gymnasium, where he received a classical education. In 1826, he began to attend the University of Berlin, and later those of Erlangen and Königsberg. He studied for 3 years, during which he also attended some of Hegel's lectures, in particular those on the philosophy of religion, the history of philosophy, and the philosophy of spirit. In 1833, he moved permanently to Berlin. From that moment on, his life was marked by various difficulties and tragic events. 2 years after his move, his stepfather died, and his mother, suffering from serious mental problems, was admitted to a mental asylum, where she remained until her death. In 1837, he married Agnes Clara Bertz, a young woman of 22. Their union was brief and tragic. Agnes died in childbirth the following year, giving birth to a premature son who did not survive. Loneliness and financial problems continued to haunt Stirner. In 1839, he found work as a history and literature teacher at a private school for upper-middle-class girls in Berlin. But in the meantime, he began to frequent the group Die Freien, the Free Ones, a circle of radical young Hegelians. Among the members were prominent figures such as Bruno Bauer, Friedrich Engels, and later, Karl Marx. Stirner and Engels were friends, their philosophical discussions often taking place in a Berlin beer hall, Hippel's. During these years, he met Marie Wilhelmina Deinhardt, who became his second wife in 1843. Their marriage, described as scandalous by contemporaries, took place in a surreal atmosphere. Friends played cards during the ceremony, the newlyweds had forgotten their rings, and Bruno Bauer found 2 brass rings in her purse. Between 1843 and 1844, Stirner worked on his masterpiece, The Ego and Its Property, which was published in November 1844, but with a post-dated printing date of 1845. Shortly before its publication, Max quit his job as a teacher and lived for 2 years on his wife's inheritance. However, the marriage ended in 1846, when Marie left him to move in with another man. She later described Stirner as a cunning man, but claimed that she had never loved or respected him. After the separation, Stirner devoted himself to several attempts to improve his financial situation. Unfortunately, they all failed. He ended up accumulating debts that led to his arrest twice, in 1853 and 1854. To survive, he began working as a translator and compiled a collection of quotations known as History of the Reaction. Max Stirner died in poverty in Berlin on June 26, 1856, at the age of 49, due to an infection that degenerated into septicemia, probably caused by an insect bite. His funeral was attended by very few friends, including Bruno Bauer. Sometime later, Ludwig Buhl organized a collection to erect a modest tombstone on his grave, later replaced in 1892 thanks to John Henry Mackay. Now it's time to delve into his most famous work, The Ego and Its Property, a text that not only scandalized modern philosophy, but also paved the way for a new form of radical and revolutionary thought. When the work was published in Berlin in 1844, its impact was immediate and overwhelming. The Prussian censors branded it as too absurd to be dangerous. But philosophers like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels thought otherwise. Not only did they take it seriously, they devoted more than 300 critical pages to it in The German Ideology, considering it an intellectual enemy to be fought. Friedrich Nietzsche, on the other hand, avoided citing him in his works, but confessed in private that he feared accusations of plagiarism due to the obvious similarity of their ideas. For decades, Stirner was relegated to the margins of philosophy, labeled alternately as a visionary, a madman, or an intellectual criminal. Yet the uniqueness of this work lies precisely in its ability to escape any classification and destroy any certainty. Max Stirner opens his book with a provocative question: what on earth should my cause be? And he immediately lists a series of ideals that, according to morality and society, should represent the guide of existence: the good cause, the cause of God, of humanity, of truth, of freedom, of justice, of the homeland. But his answer is disconcerting: never one's own cause. Stirner harshly criticizes this approach, defining altruism and sacrifice for higher causes as a deception. The individual, in fact, is always invited to sacrifice himself for something external to himself, never to put himself at the center of his own world. Society, according to Stirner, imposes a series of obligations that lead man to renounce his uniqueness, transforming him into an instrument at the service of superior entities. But what Stirner does is unmask these entities, defining them as ghosts, God, truth, humanity, the people, the state, the homeland. All these ideas are nothing but intangible constructions that feed on the sacrifice of individuals. God is concerned only with his own causes. Stirner writes, he is concerned only with himself. He thinks only of himself. He has only himself in mind. If even God is selfish, why should man give up his uniqueness for the sake of others? Stirner lucidly analyzes how these ideals, far from being disinterested, hide a selfishness that feeds on the sacrifice of others. Humanity, for example, does not care about individuals, but uses them for its own purposes, and then observes. Humanity only wants to advance humanity, and when individuals and peoples have done what humanity needs, they are then thrown by it into the mature age of history. In this, Stirner sees a profitable egoism, where great causes enrich themselves on the backs of those who serve them. The criticism also extends to political power. He describes the sovereign as the greatest example of egoism disguised as altruism. The Sultan, he writes, has founded his cause on nothing but himself. He is for himself in all respects, and for himself he is the only one. Anyone who dares to oppose this logic is marginalized or punished. Stirner asks himself once again why the individual must continue to sacrifice himself for these disguised egoisms, and adds, rather than continue to selflessly serve those selfish people, I want to be the selfish one myself. Another central aspect of the book is the criticism of traditional morality. Stirner rejects the distinction between good and bad, arguing that these categories are instruments of social control. He states, I myself am my cause, and I am neither good nor bad. Morality, like religion and the state, is nothing but another chain that limits the freedom of the individual. He also analyzes the different stages of human life, showing how the individual is constantly struggling to assert himself. In childhood, the child is trapped in natural laws and must learn to overcome the fears that paralyze him. He writes, we have withdrawn from the power of the rod when we have understood that it is too weak for our obstinacy. By this, he meant that the liberation of the individual comes through the awareness of one's own inner power. The rod symbolizes any form of authority or external imposition perceived as absolute and invincible only until it is questioned. Once the individual recognizes the weakness of these forces and discovers his own ability to resist, authority loses its power. Courage and inner strength are therefore indispensable tools to free oneself from external constraints. With youth, the individual begins to confront the world of ideas and abstract thoughts. But even these, Stirner warns, can become oppressive ghosts if they are not traced back to their origin, the individual himself. Thoughts had taken shape on their own. They were ghosts like God, the Pope, the homeland. If I destroy their corporeality, I make them re-enter mine and say, I alone have a body. He meant that thoughts and ideas, once separated from the individual who created them, become autonomous entities, ghosts that exercise an illusory power over us, as happens with abstract concepts such as God, the Pope, or the homeland. Destroying their corporeality means regaining control, recognizing that these ideas do not have an independent existence, but derive from the individual himself. Stating I alone have a body is the gesture of reclaiming one's centrality and uniqueness, freeing oneself from everything that tries to dominate us from the outside. This awareness marks the passage to adulthood, when man finally stops subordinating himself to external ideals and begins to live for himself. In adulthood, the individual achieves full control of his life, recognizing that the only purpose is his own fulfillment. Man finds himself as spirit-made flesh, writes Stirner, and places his own interest above all else. This does not mean living in isolation, but building relationships and goals based on one's own will, without allowing oneself to be manipulated by external forces. But the heart of his philosophy is summed up in a sentence as simple as it is radical. I have founded my cause on nothing. With these words, he declares that his existence is not based on ideals, authorities, or values imposed from outside, but on the complete freedom of the individual to define himself. This nothingness is not a sterile negation, but rather a creative force. Stirner distinguishes, in fact, the passive nothingness, which represents emptiness and renunciation, and the creative nothingness, which instead becomes the starting point for the construction of the self. And he writes, I am not nothing in the sense of emptiness, but the creative nothingness from which I myself, as creator, create everything. This means that the individual, freeing himself from the ghosts that oppress him, such as ideologies, religions, or any authority that imposes a superior order, can finally live according to his own will. Creative nothingness is therefore not a rejection of life, but its full affirmation. It is the act of breaking down all invisible chains to make room for an authentic existence, based on one's own desires and choices. It invites us to recognize that all external authorities, even the most sacred, are only artificial constructions that the individual can and must overcome in order to be truly free. In The Ego and Its Property, Stirner offers a radical and provocative vision of human existence. The book unmasks the illusions that govern society, showing how the individual can free himself from the chains of ideology to live an authentic and full life. As Stirner writes, if as a spirit I have pushed back the world with the deepest contempt, as a proprietor I push back the phantoms into their vanity. They no longer have power over me. But is it possible that to be truly free, we should overturn everything we have been led to believe up to now?